As the Dolphins continue to address their needs across the roster ahead of the 2024 NFL Draft, many Dolphins fans are now wondering, what about Brock Bowers? Well, what about him? That's our conversation here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami. Welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And a tip of the cap to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase on last-minute tickets. The lowest prices guaranteed. On the Dolphins over the weekend, it was announced that they would be signing Tahir Tart, an interior defensive lineman, to a contract. He was somebody who had previously this past season played in Tennessee and Houston, was cut mid-season. I kind of hope Miami would pluck him off the waiver wire. They did not. They ultimately end up getting a chance at signing him in free agency this time around. But the added competition to the defensive tackle room, when you consider what Miami's brought in the departure of Christian Wilkins. So you still have a staple piece in Zach Sealer. Raekwon Davis has gone to Indianapolis. You've gone out and got nose tackle types. Benito Jones, I think Tart can play on the nose from time to time. You get Jonathan Harris from Denver. You get Neville Gallimore from Dallas. You infuse all of this competition into this room. And now another body in Tahir Tart added to the mix 2.5 weeks ahead of the draft, 3 weeks ahead of the draft. And a lot of Dolphins fans that I know or are consuming my content or in my communities are asking, hey, what about Brock Bowers? If the Dolphins are really, truly, authentically going to check all the boxes so that we don't have to draft for need, which is the best place that you can be as a franchise, is not having to draft for need. And I think you can make an argument that Miami, the past 2 seasons between Cam Smith and Devon Achane, when you consider Jeff Wilson and Raheem Mostert were under contract, and Channing Tindall and Eric Ezukama is kind of the first 2 picks of those last 2 draft classes, those underwhelming draft classes, because in part Miami used their high premier draft capital on Tyreek Hill, Bradley Chubb, and so on. They have not been drafting for need. And the times in which Miami has gotten themselves into the most trouble with this brain trust, in my mind, is when they have drafted for need. It's when an offensive line run happens and you have to trade up to get the last guy in a tier of players that you had, and you land Liam Eichenberg, but you traded up to draft him because there was a run elsewhere on the board and other offensive linemen come off, and you wanted to get a star. That's risky business. Now, Miami is positioning themselves to not have to do that. They're continuing their flirtation with Odell Beckham. Tahir Tart signs. So you potential wide receiver 3, a potential rotational interior defensive lineman. They've added bodies on the offensive line, like bringing back Isaiah Wynn and Kendall Lamb, so that you don't have a dire needed swing tackle or a potential competitor to start for you at guard in some capacity. All of that adding up, Miami can feel pretty free coming into this draft. And Brock Bowers is the name that everybody's minds go to because, well, tight end's kind of been a sore spot for Miami in the Mike McDaniel era. Everybody knows what the running game in San Francisco looked like, in large part because of George Kittle. Mike McDaniel, in one of the pre-production meetings late in the season for one of the Dolphins games, kind of confides that the tight end's kind of the next evolution of the offense. That gets it on the air. Everybody's now thinking about tight end again. And Brock Bowers is a 3-year high-profile player on a repeat national champion who's a Swiss Army knife of a player. And I get it, right? Like, there's a lot of stuff with Brock Bowers that would be really exciting elements to mix into what the Dolphins can do. And I'll say this first. If Brock Bowers were somehow the Dolphins' draft choice in 3 weeks or 2.5 weeks, I, of course, like everybody else, I would be fired up. That there is an addition of a good player that you feel like ideologically fits your identity, who you want to be. But the pathway to getting here is where I struggle, because people who are asking me about Brock Bowers are asking about trading up for Brock Bowers. Well, can we go up 5 spots and get Brock Bowers? And I think that's where, for Miami, you have to kind of comb through a couple different layers, and that's what we're going to do here today on the show. Let's start with this. I know Pro Football Focus has a very useful tool, which is the trends, and it's the average draft position for mock drafts run through their website. Brock Bowers in the past month has hit a low point between the bell curve of where he's getting drafted, and it's somewhere between 10, 11, and 15. Between 10 and 15 is where the vast majority of the 75% of mock drafts Brock Bowers is getting drafted in. That's not necessarily super predictive because mock drafts versus the actual draft, of course, is a different conversation. But even when you look at the draft order and you consider the teams that are out there, is like Cincinnati signing Mike Gesicki going to stop them at 18 from drafting Brock Bowers? The Jets now adding the offensive tackles that they've added. They are apparently one of the red hot teams projected for Brock Bowers. So the first thing that has to fall into place is the teams that are hurdles obviously are gonna have to go in a different direction. I don't have a great deal of appetite for trading up in general in this class. Of course, that can very quickly change depending on who does and does not fall down the board. But Brock Bowers, I don't have a great deal of appetite for moving up for Brock Bowers. We're going to talk about that as we kind of comb through who he is as a player and go from there. Brock Bowers, a 3-year prominent player in the Georgia offense, has been the staple in each of the past 3 seasons. 882 yards in 2021, 942 yards in 2022, and 717 yards in just 10 games this past season. He has accounted for 26 touchdowns in that stretch of time as well, and played a lot of versatile alignments. And the Brock Bowers conversation, when you get into things that are appealing, you talk about a 50-50 snap share in 2 of the last 3 seasons between being in the slot and being in line as an inline player. I think his physical profile probably lends more favorably to him being more of a slot type weapon detached from the set formation. It's not to say he can't play with his hand in the dirt, but at 6'3" and 243 pounds, that's 23rd percentile for height and 12th percentile for weight for all tight ends to come through the NFL Combine since 2000. He also has 37th percentile wingspan and arm length. So it's not like Sam Laporta, where the big thing on Sam Laporta, when you go back and listen to the things that we did pre-draft last year, Laporta was, I think, my tight end 2 for Miami. And the only critique that I really had was that this was a player who didn't have great length to be a successful inline blocker. Well, he goes out and his wide receiver background shines, and he's a major piece of Detroit's offense this past year. And the other elements of him as a player showed up to help him be successful as a blocker. I think Bowers can do a lot of that. But he is somebody who I think is more Dalton Kincaid than he is George Kittle. And George, of course, is the weapon that he is because he can play attached to the formation and he can individual solo block in pass protection and in the run game. And that's the thing about tight ends, right? The appeal of a tight end is he brings the elements of a pass catcher while simultaneously bring the elements of an offensive line. And if you're not that, then you have to bring other ambiguous value to the offense in other ways. And while Bowers is a great space blocker, he's a great second level blocker, he's a great angular blocker, he's a great outside the numbers blocker. Hand in the dirt, Brock Bowers is not really a player that I think moves the needle. You're not drafting him to do that because that's not where he shines. He shines with the ball in his hands. He shines as an offensive weapon with his instincts, and he can make really tough catches over the middle of the field, and he'll make electric plays, and you can get him as a more impactful blocker on the perimeter. That's where Brock Bowers wins. We're going to talk a little bit more about the pros and cons of Brock Bowers and his game, some trends, some things to note. That's coming up next here on this episode of Locked on Dolphins. So stick with us. Buying tickets does not have to be a super stressful experience thanks to our friends at Gametime. Gametime is completely committed to you having total peace of mind with your purchase when you go shopping for your favorite football event, basketball event, baseball event, concerts, comedy, theater, you name it, all available on Gametime. You can save up to 60% off on buying last minute tickets for all of those events, and you could save even more with exclusive in-app deals ahead of the game or event. You can make sure you get all in pricing so that you get no surprises when you put tickets into your cart. Go to checkout. No entry or no additional fees that will pop up. You can know exactly what you're signing up for when you select the tickets. You can also get that panoramic view from your seat to make sure the sight lines are exactly what you want before you hit purchase. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today for last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. Brock, really electric playmaker with the ball in his hands. I think that's the obvious thing that stands out. 18 forced missed tackles and 8.7 yards after catch per reception. And you think about, again, go back to what are the pillars of identity for this offense? And they have talked about wanting to yak teams to death. We want to create a bunch of explosive plays. We want to do so with speed. We want to make sure that we're getting the ball into our playmakers' hands. Brock Bowers, 2.65 yards per route run. That's a very, very, very healthy number. And this comes in spite of an average depth of target of about 6.5 yards downfield. So he's not a seam buster prototype down the field, big body, get behind the linebackers and gouge him on vertical routes type of player. But he's a player, he's almost like the antithesis of Mike Gesicki as a player. Mike's was best in that element of his game, and he had the catch radius to really win contested catches. So Brock Bowers, for his career, has about a 52% contested catch rate. So he's good in those situations. But he's really more get the ball in my hands, get my eyes upfield, let my contact balance and my short area agility really shine, where Mike was like a locomotive, right? Like everything was as a long strider at 6'6". There was not a lot of subtle adjustments in a three-dimensional plane for Mike Gesicki. So I think about Brock Bowers and the appeal here, beyond being a lot of what Miami wants to be, is it gives you a long-term stability piece to that. And we'll get into opportunity cost in just a minute. But when you think about Brock Bowers as a offensive weapon and not a tight end, you kind of get put into the same conversation that's been had with Dalton Kincaid. And Dalton Kincaid was a first-round pick for the Buffalo Bills last year. And I'm not saying Dalton Kincaid's the reason why Stephon Diggs was traded from Buffalo. Obviously, there were other storylines involved with that that helped facilitate that departure for Buffalo. But Kincaid finished this past season with 73 receptions for 673 yards, 2 touchdowns, played in 16 games. He was targeted 91 times as a rookie. And he had a passer rating of 95 when targeted, over 4 yards after catch per reception for Dalton Kincaid. And this is a player who lived predominantly detached from the formation in the slot. That's where the Brock Bowers appeal is obvious. He can do the same things. And for Miami to, if he's not going to be an inline player, where can you bring ambiguity that otherwise does not exist? Think about the Dolphins receivers in the run game and how they're charged with blocking from tight alignments. If that becomes Brock Bowers, it becomes much more ambiguous for when we are in run personnel versus when we are pass personnel. Now, that would require a shift from Miami to be a more 12 personnel heavy team. And that takes us back to a conversation that we had the other week, which is addressing versus investing. Are the Dolphins going to choose to invest in the tight end position? Or are they just going to address it? Because if you're going to address it, then what you have with Jonnu Smith being added on top of Jody Fortson as kind of an injury-prone flyer that has some talent that couldn't quite get off the ground in Kansas City, with a Durham Smythe contract as your inline player, Julian Hill as a developmental type, like that's probably enough. They have been swinging the bat at this position, but I don't think they've been swinging the bat with investments. They've been trying to uncover the gem. This would be a departure from that, and it would be a departure from their personnel tendencies as well. That's not to say it won't happen, but that's the question that I have. Because if you're content to say, well, we're going to be a 21 personnel with Alec Ingold, and then we're going to be 11 personnel when we got to pass the ball, I don't know that you've got the volume here to justify a multi-year contract for Jonnu Smith plus potentially adding Brock Bowers to the mix, especially when you consider this is probably a trade-up candidate for you when it is all said and done. So I want to set the proper expectation, though, for Brock Bowers as a player. There's a lot of kind of thrown around the word generational, best tight end prospect in a really long time, and that may be true and most productive for sure. But as far as like NFL tight end prospects go, Brock Bowers is definitively a first-round player. But if your expectation is like Baby Gronk, or like we try to give that nickname to somebody every single year and it doesn't happen. The last guy that had Baby Gronk nickname was Michael Mayer, and he fell out of the first round altogether and had a relatively quiet first year for the Raiders. And you understand some of that is in part because of the offense that they ran and the quarterback situation that they had. But I think about Brock Bowers. I don't think he's likely to go in the first 9 picks. That's when you consider positional value of other spots. This is not a player who I think is going to get plugged in and just be lights out, high volume snap taker. I mean, case in point, his career to this point, 312 snaps in the passing game this past season. And in total, he played 688 snaps in 2021, his freshman season. The year after that, he played 884 snaps in 2022. And then he played 525 snaps this year. He missed about a third of the season. So he's taking meaningful snaps, but he's not really getting a lot of exposure in some of the ancillary areas of playing the position. He, from a pass protection standpoint, was given 25 opportunities to pass block in 2023. And you're not drafting Brock Bowers to pass block. I know 21 pass block reps in 2022, but at least the viability of it has to exist. His season with the most pass block opportunities that he got was as a freshman in 2021, which he pass blocked 31 times. So don't expect this to be the do-it-all fix-all for tight end. I wouldn't put him in protection, right? I wouldn't put his hand in the dirt and ask him to road grade in the run game because he's a smaller player for tight ends. But if you hear the word generational, you kind of expect, oh, he's going to be able to do this, he's going to be able to do that, he's going to be able to do this, he's going to be able to do that. And I just don't, that's not who Brock Bowers is. I don't think he tears up man coverage all that much either. He makes some really, really tough catches. He's got outstanding hands. He'd be the best tight end on the roster by a good margin for the Dolphins. There's no question. But this isn't like he got to 12. Well, let's trade next year's 1 and run up there. I mean, you could talk about trade candidates and who you have to worry about drafting Brock Bowers, and that's what we're going to do next year on the show. But just wanted to kind of calibrate who Brock Bowers is as a player, because so often when somebody explodes onto the scene as a college prospect, they develop this reputation that maybe as they continue to be productive and the team continues to win, and then they're a centerpiece in that, their reputation kind of expands beyond what the player is, which in Brock Bowers' case is a very dangerous hybrid offensive weapon, is what he is. He is not the traditional tight end, and he is not George Kittle, which I know is kind of one of the subplots of Miami with Mike McDaniel, is they need to find their George Kittle. I don't think that Brock Bowers would be that. He's a very different kind of player. So let's talk draft order, draft trade potential, that all up next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is sponsored by BetterHelp. A lot of us spend our lives wishing that we had more time, but the question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you choose to use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters most to you so that you can do more of it. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOn. So looking at the draft order, I think the first threat, you consider Chicago is paying Cole Kmet $12 million a season. The first threat is the Jets at 10. Anything above that, it's going to be a no-go. I can think back to Pittsburgh trading from 20 to 10 for Devin Bush, and they gave up a future first-round pick as a part of that deal. Like that caliber of difference in the draft order is just going to be too great for Miami to justify for a player who is a really nice hybrid offensive weapon. But the question of the returns of it doesn't match up for me with where Miami's at from a team building perspective, getting ready to pay out some big contracts, coveting the rookie contracts that come with draft picks, and so on and so forth. Minnesota, probably not. They're going to be a quarterback destination. Denver, Las Vegas at 12 and 13. Two improbable tight end spots. The Saints feel like a very highly likely tackle spot. Then you get into like Indianapolis at 15. That's maybe a spot where, I mean, they've continuously invested in tight ends. They're a team that likes to attack that position between Kylan Granson. They've had Mo Alley Cox for there forever. They took the Virginia kid last year with one of their highest picks, Jelani Woods, at that tight end spot. But they've continuously been attacking that spot. I'd be curious if that's not a spot, depending on how the board breaks for them at 15. Seattle brought back Noah Fant. Jacksonville feels like a potential trade down candidate. And then Cincinnati at 18, which I think is what sets the stage for kind of this hard wall for Miami if you're going to get into it and really go after Brock Bowers. If Cincinnati decides they want him, and he does get past Indianapolis and the New York Jets, since he just has to play defense, right? And for Miami, what you don't want to do is end up overpaying to get up over top of one team for a player. There's too many other good players at other spots, and quite frankly, other players that I think are more valuable to hold on a rookie contract. Remember, the rookie wage scale exists where if you get drafted 17th overall, your salary is fixed. And depending on what position you play, that may be a good net value, depending if you play well, or it might be a bad net value. So for the lower value position contracts like tight end and safety and running back, using a first round player with a fixed salary on that pick creates kind of this economic imbalance where these players come into the league and they're disproportionately high in the pay amongst their peers at that position. That's not to say Brock Bowers wouldn't be worth what he would ultimately get, but it is kind of the added elements of economics within the game that you at least want to acknowledge. And I know Miami in years past, I can think of at least one instance in particular where Miami has wanted to try to come up for a player, and a team that was sitting higher up in the order played defense, and it allowed a trade to happen where a team closer than Miami got up into the spot to pick a player because you just don't want to dramatically overpay. I think there's enough landmines between 10 and 20 that I would be surprised if Brock Bowers gets there to 21. If he were to be at 21, you determine he's the best player on the board for you, draft him. Absolutely. But if the conversation shifts to trading up for him or most players, I think most of the players that I would advocate for trading up for are probably going to be going within the first 8 picks. Then you kind of just let it go. You shift your eyes to the next thing. There's going to be another good value for you at 21. This board is going to be stacked favorably in that regard. And you covet the volume element of the draft. We just got done talking quite a bit about how there's not enough volume in the draft capital for the Dolphins in the last 2 years. So to trade up for a tight end when the long-term questions about the stability of the offensive line, including a tackle spot, still exists. You have a lot of competition, but maybe not an impact player next to Sealer on the defensive interior. That still exists. You have the Tyreek Hill contract looming that you haven't addressed. Is he still in the long-term plans for the team? Is he going to be playing here this year? And then the Dolphins will be assessing their options. He'd already kind of alluded to he's going to play out the end of the contract and then retire. There's a lot of questions there, right? And at least a wide receiver, you could maybe look at Brock Bowers and say, well, and he's a hybrid passing weapon like a Dalton Kincaid. If he gets to Miami, we'll be pumped. If Miami trades up for him, I'll understand why it happened, and then the conversation will go to the cost. You look at some of the other recent trades in the past few NFL drafts, and moving up a handful of spots in the teens. Pittsburgh and New England did it for the Steelers to jump the Jets and draft Broderick Jones. That cost a 4 a few years back, but that was like 17 to 13 versus 20 to or 21 to somewhere in the teens. But if you want to get up and ensure that you get Brock Bowers, that cost is going to be too steep for me. And Miami doesn't have a 4 this year anyway. At least things currently stand. They don't have a 3 either. So now you're getting the pick swaps, and now you're potentially surrendering significant ground for your second pick if you had to put in a 1 and a 2 to get back a earlier 1 and a 3. And I don't know how much I'd love that either, because I think that spot at 55 can get you a really, really good player as well. That is going to do it for the Brock Bowers conversation. If he's there at 21, great. If he's not there at 21, somebody else will be there that I'm going to be happy he is. That's kind of the school of thought that I am at with Brock Bowers. No question, as an offensive weapon, run after catch, really reliable hands, versatile piece. He can bring something to this Dolphins offense, and more of something to this Dolphins offense with a different kind of physicality to it. But don't expect a cure-all player to be coming into the fray if that's the case. And because that's the case, I am more than content to let the board come to me if I am the Dolphins. But that's just my 2 cents on the matter. I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation on the Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I appreciate you guys checking out the show. You can find us on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Make it a great rest of your day. I'm out of here. Fins up.